Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada event. This one is on charting Canada's maritime future, featuring a conversation with Vice-Admiral Topshee. It is so wonderful to see so many of you in person because I know a number of folks had challenges given the weather. It's the first snow of the season here in Vancouver and schools have been canceled, but this event is also being live streamed and is on the record and will be used for various publications with the Asia-Pacific Foundation. But before I go too much further, please let me acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we're extremely grateful for the Indigenous people in Canada for their stewardship of this land on which we live, work, and play. And the Asia-Pacific Foundation is very much committed to the work of reconciliation that we're all engaged in. As I mentioned, this is on the record, and we will very much try to have a real conversation. So Admiral Topshee has generously agreed to give us some opening remarks, after which I'll ask him a few questions in a moderated conversation, and then very much we'll turn to you all for your questions. We're very privileged to have an audience of very distinguished people, consul generals from a number of countries, Germany, South Korea, Malaysia, France, who are here with us today, as well as a number of retired diplomats, distinguished professors, university students, board members of the Asia-Pacific Foundation. So it's really terrific to have all of you here, and I hope that we can have a real discussion on a very important topic of Canada's maritime future, but also Canada's sovereignty and Canada's national security at a fairly critical moment in time. So I know that kind of the big question in the room, or the big elephant in the room, is what's happening south of the border and the latest sort of threats that we're hearing from President Trump, including on issues of Canada not doing enough to pay for its own defense. So I think Admiral will obviously be in a position to share some thoughts on that as well, and I hope we can have that discussion. He has, of course, had a very distinguished professional career in Royal Canadian Navy. His biography you all have, but let me obviously mention that he's the 38th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, has been in this role since May 2022. He's had a number of other posts, and his official biography mentions that the two highlights are his role as the command of Her Majesty's ship Algonquin from 2009 to 2010, as well as his 3 years command of Canada's Pacific Fleet. I know that Admiral has also had senior positions dealing with NORAD, which again will be topical today, and has even served on deployment in Afghanistan, actually working on the national police there, which is quite interesting. So we're extremely privileged to have the Admiral join us here today to talk about Canada's commitment to the Indo-Pacific maritime security, but also more generally. So with those brief introductory remarks, let me invite you, Admiral, to offer your thoughts. Thank you so much. Yeah, please.
All right. Well, first of all, let me echo the thanks to all of you for coming. I've spent enough time on the West Coast to really appreciate what a very small amount of snow in Vancouver can do to complicate this city, especially with the buses, which I'm quite sure definitely do not have winter tires, it seems. So as was noted, I took command of the Royal Canadian Navy just over 2.5 years ago. It's been an absolute highlight to be in command of this great force. We have what most countries would consider a small to medium-sized Navy. But unlike most other countries with a Navy about our size, we are truly globally deployable. Our ships go everywhere in the world. And in fact, as we talk right now, one of our new Arctic and offshore patrol vessels is in Brazil on its way south, headed to Antarctica. The first time a Royal Canadian ship will have deployed to Antarctica, as best we can tell in our records. And that's just part of our goal, is to get out and understand what's going on in the world. Part of the reason to go to a place like Antarctica is actually we spend a lot of time in our high north. We are very engaged and interested in climate change and its impact in particular on the peoples of the north and our ability to ensure continued Canadian sovereignty and security in that region. Heading south allows us to compare with a scientific expedition put together by the Government of Canada. What is the nature of climate change down there from our own observations? And more importantly, what are other countries doing down there? Specifically, some countries which we know are in our Arctic every winter. What are they doing in the Antarctic? And how does that compare to what we see in the far north? And so specifically, we're very interested in what China's activities are in Antarctica. And that's part of our goal, is to see that again firsthand. And so the other big feature for the Royal Canadian Navy lately has been the release of the Indo-Pacific strategy. In November of 2022, the Government of Canada directed that that Indo-Pacific would be a focus for us, and specifically for the Navy, it was quite specific. In fact, it said that we would deploy 3 warships a year into the Indo-Pacific, a pace that we have maintained for some time since then. And right now, HMCS Ottawa is actually conducting a port visit in Cambodia as part of that Indo-Pacific strategy, visiting the region and being aware of what's going on there. And we are moving from our old posture was that we would send 1 or 2 ships a year into the Indo-Pacific, and our partners in the region quite rightly pointed out that we were inconsistent. We talked a big game, but we weren't often there. We have moved, thanks to the Indo-Pacific strategy, to a framework of persistent presence. Ottawa was there over the Christmas holidays. It deliberately stayed in the region because we wanted to make sure that everyone in the region understood that Canada is an Indo-Pacific nation. We are absolutely, as you well know here in Vancouver, we are absolutely a Pacific nation. And so Ottawa will be returning home in a couple of months. It will be replaced by Ville de Quebec. And after that, we'll be deploying another ship and another ship. And our intention is to be, so that everyone in the region sees that there is always a Canadian ship in theater, or having just left or just about to arrive. And that's an important signal, because what that persistence allows us to do is make lasting relationships where we're not resetting from zero every time. We recognize when there are changes in leadership of the partner navies we work with, changes in government policy that are of interest. And we can see changes in the environment, such as how does the activities around Second Thomas Shoal, have those changed markedly? Is the sort of presence of the People's Liberation Army Navy different? Are there, is the manner in which they're acting different? And the challenge for us is that we really want to be in a posture where we are prepared for any aggression from China, but we're not contributing to a belief in their minds that they have to be aggressive. Because the fundamental belief, and as outlined in the Indo-Pacific strategy, is that it really is, in nautical terms, a rising tide lifts all boats. That we are most effective as a world and a collective of peaceful countries when we have a rules-based international order that allows us to peacefully resolve disputes. We've seen that ourselves. The fact that we were able to resolve our dispute with Denmark over Hans Island, and now Canada has a second land border, I think that's a highlight of what we're able to do. We've had an often tense relationship with the US. We continue to have maritime boundary disputes with the US. But there's no chance that we go to war over those boundary disputes, because we know that there is a process by which we can both state our cases and have it fairly and impartially adjudicated. And so I think that's an important part of this. The final thing I'll leave you with, because you are here in the most important port in Canada, is one of the things that I think has not been truly appreciated is, since the Second World War, the dramatic increase in the standard of living for countries and peoples around the world has been fostered by global trade carried by sea. The 2 most important innovations or things that have occurred in that post-Second World War period are the invention of the shipping container, which you can certainly see featured anywhere there is water around Vancouver. And the second thing is the free and open use of the seas for all. And it is like Wi-Fi nowadays, free shipping. We only notice it when it's not working. We only notice it when a ship turns sideways in the Suez Canal, or someone starts lobbing rockets at ships in the Red Sea, or someone threatens to stop traffic through the Panama Canal, which, by the way, was already threatened by climate change because of lower waters limiting container volumes through there. And so I think we really need to appreciate what we have had and just the incredible benefit that having common use of the world's ocean to benefit all has been a huge enabler to a growth in the standard of living in just about every country in the world. And so my goal as the commander of the Navy is to continue to be a part of a global group of navies that work to ensure that we continue that legacy. And so with that, I think it would probably be more interesting to move on to some questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Admiral. And actually, before I go too much further, let me say that I'm Veena Najibullah. I forgot to introduce myself. For those in the room, that's less of an issue. But of course, we have folks joining us online. And I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President of Research and Strategy here at the Foundation. And it's really wonderful to be able to ask you a few questions to begin. But then, of course, as I said, we'll turn to the audience. Admiral, you mentioned that the Indo-Pacific strategy, which came online 2 years ago, has kind of of made your life a little bit simpler because it sort of defines what Canada is meant to do in the Pacific. Maybe if you were to reflect on the first 2 years, you mentioned persistent presence as a key objective. What else has gone well in the 2 years in terms of our presence and participation in establishing that kind of free and open Indo-Pacific? And what have been the challenges, as you can observe, in the last 2 years?
So I think that the biggest change that we've noticed is that we've got the resources that we need to be able to do this. And so the government has increased the amount of funding available to the Canadian Armed Forces in general to be more persistent in the region. We've also seen a lot of greater ministerial presence, because in this region it really does matter if ministers turn up as well, and that we move things forward tangibly. And so we've seen advances. We've not quite got across the finish line on as many as I would like, but on things like status of visiting forces agreements, information sharing arrangements, all of these things that enable our operations. Okay, is that better now? That now I can hear myself. All right. So to repeat that, so it's the resourcing that the Government of Canada has provided to us and to the Canadian Armed Forces overall. We are also seeing ministerial visits, which is a huge help because that often unlocks doors and allows us to move forward on negotiating different agreements. We're seeing an increased interest in the region in terms of invitations to participate in different places, and a real focus on getting out in the region and better understanding it. It's also allowed us, the challenge for Canada has always been, when you look at our geographic positioning in the world, we have no natural region of the world, right? We're obviously an Arctic state. We will never forget that we are a Euro-Atlantic nation. We're tied into NATO and everything else like that. And every map in Canada, much to my frustration, takes an Atlantic-centric view where Asia is just shoved off to the far left, which means it's actually on the far right of the map. And it's hard for us to figure out. We occasionally think, well, should we be in Africa? Should we be in South America and all these other places? The Indo-Pacific strategy has made it clear that this is a priority region for government and that we're to be in that area. And in fact, as you think about how the Canadian Armed Forces overall are sort of dividing up responsibility at the moment, I would say the Air Force very clearly is given a tremendous responsibility with NORAD modernization, a massive investment in securing our continent, working with the Americans quite closely to do that, and some incredible progress as you look at the recapitalization of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Likewise, the Army is in Latvia, and that's really meaningful. We're going back to the days of the Cold War where the message to Russia is, if you cross the Latvian border, you are at war with Canada. This isn't a promise. We've put our soldiers on the line, and we will fight because we're there. And that is a significant difference in deterrence from not having a presence but having a promise. And then finally for the Navy, it's like our focus is very clearly, we have taken resources away from NATO and refocused them towards the Indo-Pacific. That's why last year HMCS Montreal, an East Coast ship, deployed into the Indo-Pacific. This year HMCS Ville de Quebec, another East Coast ship, will deploy into the Pacific. And that's a big change in pattern for us. Historically, we sent West Coast ships to Europe. And so we've reversed that to really show that this is tangible and real.
So on that note then, Admiral, because when we look at the map, the Atlantic Ocean looks big, but that's about a 7-day voyage, from what I understand, from Canada to reach Europe. In the case of the Pacific, it's a 21-day voyage, right? And we've had, in the Indo-Pacific strategy, it said 3 frigates would be passing through the Indo-Pacific, including through Taiwan Strait. And of course, that's great, but it requires a lot more resources, a lot more capacity, and it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody in the room, and obviously to you, that we've had issues with the platforms, with the ships that we're using. They're old. And so can you speak a little bit about those challenges and how you're addressing them? Because it's great that we have a priority area, but it's a very vast ocean and region to try to be meaningfully present in.
Yeah, it is a huge ocean. So as you say, it's 7 days just to get to Hawaii, which most people would not consider to be across the Pacific Ocean. That same 7-day transit takes you into the Mediterranean out of Halifax. So we only have 12 frigates. And when you look at Indo-Pacific, it's a surface combatant theater. And the fact that we are able to deploy 3 or 4 of our frigates every year on a force that size is pretty impressive. The other challenge we face is that every one of those frigates was commissioned between 1992 and 1996, designed for a 30-year lifespan.
So they're past their life.
Well, there's HMCS Ottawa, I think, still has about 6 months left to go, or so, a year or something like that. And I'll tell you, the company did a great job of designing them for a 30-year lifespan.
But so now you have to have them operational for another 15 years?
15 years, yeah. So we are building a new destroyer, the River-class destroyer. The first one actually will be named HMCS Fraser. because of the significance of that river to this region and to this port. But unfortunately, we only just started the initial construction work last year. Full rate production doesn't start until April of this year. And it won't deliver until sometime early in the 2030s. The first time it will deploy operationally is 10 years from now. And so to sustain the frigates, and the problem is not the first one that deploys operationally. If we're deploying 4 frigates a year, I need 4 River-class destroyers to deploy operationally. So we're looking at making sure we deliver 9 of those ships by 2040. And in the meantime, we're figuring out how we make the frigates keep going. There's a lot of interesting work there. The challenge for us right now is we're replacing parts that were never designed to be replaced in the life of the ship, which we can do. We've got incredible facilities. If you ever have the chance to go across to Victoria, probably the most modern facility in Esquimalt Harbour and arguably the southern mainland is the Fleet Maintenance Facility, Cape Breton. And one of the largest buildings in Canada. It is a state-of-the-art maintenance facility where we have technicians that are globally deployable. We routinely send our technicians around the world to maintain our ships in service, and we assist the Army and the Air Force as well. And that's a workforce of over 1,200 people at each of the fleet maintenance facilities in the 2 coasts. One of the hidden gems of the Government of Canada when it comes to different things.
Is that why so much of the budget is going to procurement and to the Navy? Is it to maintain these frigates basically for the next 15 years?
Yeah, we are absolutely the elephant in the room when it comes to operations and maintenance for the Canadian Armed Forces. So our North Strong and Free did commit to an extra $10 billion of funding. But this is the challenge. We talk sometimes about getting to 2% of gross domestic product. We could probably get to that number just by fully investing in the fleets that we have right now across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Special Forces, the digital backbone that we require, and the infrastructure we already have.
And why can't we get there then? So why aren't we doing exactly that, Admiral?
Because we've been financially limited is the simple reality. And this is not just tied to any specific government. If you really want to understand defense spending in Canada, the correlation is not to what government's in power, it's what's the economic performance at the moment. The economy is doing better, we spend more on defense. The economy is doing worse, we spend less on defense.
What do you say to those who say, even if you were to give the 2% right now, that we can't actually spend it because procurement is broken, because we don't have the personnel? So what's your argument to that?
We can absolutely spend it. In terms of executable demand, I could turn on more than $1.5 billion just for the frigates alone next year. That's money. Infrastructure demand, we could spend that money. Now, if it's terms of things like the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, where the government has directed us to explore the acquisition of up to 12 conventionally powered submarines, my job is to identify what are the submarines that will work for Canada. And to be honest, what I've told the team is, of the group of submarine building nations that are around, tell me which ones won't work for us. Everything else remains an option. So let's not go what's best for us, what is not going to work for us, and how do we get government in a position where they can then create a strategic partnership with the right country to deliver the right submarine.
Well, on that topic, from what I understand, about 6 countries have actually put in their bids, including South Korea. Is there anything that you can share in terms of how that process is going and the timelines for that on the submarines? Yeah,
so we were really pleased with the responses that we've received to the request for information. And the next step for us will be to really look at potentially an invitation to qualify. There's a whole bunch of different procurement process, but the political signal has been quite clear that there's a desire for us to explore that. And so really for us, it's getting ground truth of what's the range of these submarines, what's the capacity of these submarines, what's the maintenance, because it's all great if you buy a really beautiful shiny submarine, but if it spends all of its time in harbor being repaired, it's not really helpful.
No. And is it something that needs to also be considered with respect to the Arctic? Do we want these submarines to be able to sort of sail up there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Arctic is essential for us. How far it needs to go under the Arctic ice cap is a whole separate question, because to be honest, the best way to patrol the Arctic is with some of the autonomous and uncrewed systems that are already being built by including a company like Cellular Robotics right here on the West Coast. So we think that networking sensors under the water is the right way to patrol under the ice. But what you need is the response capability to make sure that deterrence is real and meaningful. When we need to deny our waters to an adversary, then a submarine is the best way to.
Okay. Well, let's continue with the topic of the Arctic. So again, as you mentioned, Canada has 3 oceans, but of course, the Arctic Ocean, I mean, it's very, very far removed from our consciousness. And in fact, it actually is easier for you to get across the Pacific and Atlantic than to go up to patrol our own territory, right? So, I mean, it is a really harsh environment. If you could speak a little bit to how that environment is changing. I mean, we're hearing a lot about the impact of climate change, the ice is melting, the potential opening up of the Northwest Passageway, and what what that means with respect to kind of the presence of Russians, the Chinese, who've declared themselves a near Arctic state. So how do you see kind of both the threats and the opportunities that are now becoming kind of more obvious in the Arctic?
Yeah, so I think the single biggest threat to the Arctic is for the people up there is the impact of climate change. Just what that means for permafrost, what that means for the resources that they have come to rely upon in the north, coastal erosion, the just changes in the nature of the ice. There is a belief that the Northwest Passage is somehow easier to navigate. In fact, the way climate change has been working so far, it's more difficult to navigate. And the reason for that is it's not that there's more ice, there's less ice, but there's more of the wrong type of ice. And so the Beaufort Gyre comes around and pushes ice up against the western side of the Canadian Arctic archipelago.
Because it's moving counterclockwise.
And exactly. And so it pushes, so what we're finding is old ice inclusions and ice pack in areas that we wouldn't have normally expected them, because all of that would normally have stayed static. And so there you're just dealing with first year ice, which is predictable and you can break through it. We've got now taken delivery of about to take delivery of the 5th of the Arctic and Offshore Patrol vessels. They'll take delivery of the 6th one by the end of the year. Those ships are proper icebreakers. Like, they break 4.5 feet of ice. Like,
this is Harry DeWolf.
The Harry DeWolf class, exactly. And if you want to give that some context, the only U.S. Coast Guard cutter that operates in the Arctic right now is U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy. It's a medium icebreaker, and it also breaks 4.5 feet of ice. So we already have, in the Navy alone, 4 ships in operation that break as much ice as the Healy. We're delivering 2 more. The Coast Guard's getting 2 more. And those aren't even truly the purpose-built icebreakers for the Canadian government. So, because there's more beyond that. So, we absolutely already have the capacity to go up into our Arctic, and our sailors are demonstrating that every year, taking those icebreakers up into our north.
But are you saying that the Northwest Passage is not opening up at a rate that some people are speculating, that it's still quite difficult to...
Yeah, I don't think it'll ever be a viable commercial shipping route, except for taking stuff into the Arctic. And the other thing that we forget about ice is that, so while the minimum ice extent that's recorded every September is absolutely getting worse, and the minimum ice extent years are all in the most recent years, the maximum ice extent has not changed significantly, right? So the Arctic is always going to be cold and dark in February, and it's going to be really icy. And so now, is that ice thinner overall? Yes. But, and could there be a tipping point? Potentially, but not so much, I think, that it stops being that icy in winter.
So if the Northwest Passageway, in your view, will never become a shipping lane, but there is still a possibility that it's becoming easier to access, that certain actors, notably China, might come in because of the natural resources that they can find up there, both in terms of the minerals, but also fishing stock. From what I understand, now there is a moratorium on fishing up there, but that may not hold, and China may not also respect that as stocks get depleted elsewhere. So could you speak a little bit to kind of those issues and how you're viewing them?
Yeah, so legally I don't think there's any challenge to Canadian sovereignty, because even if we were to lose the argument that the Northwest Passage is an international strait, Article 234 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea gives us the right to regulate travel through those areas because of the ice-covered nature of those things and the pristine nature of it. And that's one of the great achievements of Canadian diplomacy, right? Because that is not a reviewable set of regulations. There's, we have the absolute right to set the regulations that we need to protect that region.
Up to a certain distance from our coast?
So that's it, right? So up to within our exclusive economic zone, right? And within the normally ice-covered areas, which is the entire Arctic. So the challenge is that there is an area of high seas, right? So especially if you look north of North America in the Beaufort, so north of the Beaufort, there's an area of high seas that's beyond the 200 nautical mile limit for everybody and isn't touched by any continental shelf extension, because we're talking about living resources which are not covered by a continental shelf extension. That is an area of potential competition. And the other thing I think we need to remember is that the Arctic nations, 7 members of NATO and Russia, are all what most people would describe as white, and with the exception of Russia, Western nations. And there's a global South that might say, well, why do you get to keep all of the resources of that region and deprive us of that bounty up there, especially when I believe it's something like 40% of the world still get their protein from the sea. And so, yeah, there'd be a powerful incentive potentially to go up there, especially in the summer when if the ice starts to disappear, and we're seeing evidence fish stocks are migrating up there. And we know from watching fish stocks around the world and fishing fleets follow fish. And whether the law permits it or not, where there isn't enforcement, they will go. And so that's why Canada works. One of the things I'm most proud of is the fact we work on a dark vessel detection program with a number of coastal nations to help them enforce their fisheries protections, help them monitor coastal fleets. The final thing I'll say, just to be very fair to China, but I know that might sound unusual.
No, it's okay.
But every time they come into our waters, they do ask our permission.
For
right?
purposes of exploration or for what?
Because they are legally required under the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea. If they come inside our 200-mile limit, if they want to conduct a scientific expedition, if they want to transit through the Northwest Passage, they are required to ask our permission. So in fact, the last time the Way Along went through the Northwest Passage, it had a Canadian ice pilot on board who was a retired Canadian admiral. They had some of our scientists on board. So now, the reason they do that, I would argue, is because they want to be able to say, well, when we come to your waters, we follow your rules. When you come to our waters, you have to follow our rules. The challenge is we don't agree with the interpretation of the rules.
Their waters in South China Sea.
That's right.
Right. And I was just going to ask, are they coming up to the Arctic more often? Are these requests more frequent than they have been? Or
they've generally been staying in the areas beyond the exclusive economic zone the last little while, but they are in the Arctic every year, and they're in the Antarctic every year. So China has an interest in the pole.
I wish we had a map, Admiral, because I know probably folks in the audience are getting a little bit challenged to picture all of these places that you're mentioning, but I think it is really helpful for us to understand both the challenges, but also to kind of right-size that challenge, that it's not tomorrow that the passageway will open up. So,
well, and the other challenge we have is whenever we show a map of the Arctic archipelago, the little symbol that we use for where the ship is usually covers a couple 100 miles. Wow. Right? And so we then think, oh, okay, we've put 3 ships up there. We've covered the whole thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's like saying that 3 ships are going to cover the entire Pacific. It's a vast region, and it's complicated because it's only surveyed to modern standards for about 10% of it overall. It changes every year with the nature of the ice. And it's a harsh and unforgiving environment as well.
Right. You mentioned, Admiral, that we now have these 4 Harry DeWolf class Arctic, what do we call them?
Arctic and offshore patrol vessels.
Patrol vessels.
I call them icebreakers.
Icebreakers. And that the U.S. only has 1. Is it my understanding that as part of NATO now, we have some kind of agreement with the U.S., Finland, and Germany, is it, to build more? Or is that something different?
So the Ice Pact is Canada, Finland, and the United States. And that's about sharing icebreaking technology. And this is something I think we should be really proud of here in Canada. We have built a pretty impressive shipbuilding industry here. And so we have already launched 5 ships under the National Shipbuilding Strategy from the Seaspan Yard in North Vancouver. The last one, the HMCS Protector, launched right before Christmas, is the longest ship ever built in Canada. And what's more important to me is I'm seeing the growth in a sovereign shipbuilding capability, because while Protector has had its delays and challenges, it's the first ship of that size and complexity that yard had ever built. The second one is already showing all the advantages and benefits of that, and is going to come quite quickly, come much quicker than Protector, showing a real sign of improvement. And they're building the offshore oceanographic and science vessel that's already been launched. So 5 ships delivered on this coast, 6 ships now launched on the East Coast, because all 6 of the Harry DeWolf class are now in the water. It's just the nuance of when does it actually get delivered to the department, and when do I get to use it, which is always a year or 2 behind the actual launch date.
And this is part of the National Shipbuilding Strategy that was launched 10 years ago.
That's right.
And obviously now, I'm sure everybody in the audience also is familiar that we're kind of in this race when it comes to shipbuilding with China. I mean, the statistics we just saw, I think The Economist a couple of months ago had these tables that essentially showed that China is now producing 50% of all the ships, and that they're kind of building them faster than anybody else, and the US is having a really hard time keeping up. So is this something that obviously Canada is bringing to the table that we don't often speak about? So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So the U.S. right now is very challenged for shipbuilding. Like, they are really struggling with shipbuilding. They're not producing nuclear submarines at the rate that they would like to, either their attack submarines or their ballistic missile submarines. They are not maintaining their ships in a state that they would like to. They're not building ships as quickly as they would like to. So for all of the complaints that I hear about Canadian shipbuilding, I would argue that we're actually investing very sensibly and deliberately into our shipbuilding industry here. And I think the Ice Pact could really mean some interesting things for the Davie Yard in Quebec, which is the most recent of the yards to join the National Shipbuilding Strategy. So I'm optimistic about that, and I think that's going to really resonate with the U.S. because, like I said, they're struggling. But when we talk scale in Canada for shipbuilding, like, we're not even in junior A compared to the NHL of shipbuilding. I visited the Hanwha and Hyundai yards in Korea last fall, and Hanwha is building 3 ships that are bigger than the Protector class every 6 weeks, liquid natural gas carriers, right? And that's just one of their lines of business. Hyundai is bigger than that, and China is bigger than that again. And so the People's Liberation Army Navy is now the largest navy in the world in terms of the absolute number of ships. They're not the most powerful yet. That's still the U.S. Navy by a long shot. But they are clearly building a navy that it will be globally deployable, blue water navy. And the real question is, what do they intend to do with it? Because the challenge we face as a military person is, I can see capability. Because I can measure capability. In fact, we could, that's always an intent, much harder to understand. Russia has sent some pretty clear indicators of their negative intent with the invasion of Ukraine and then the full-scale invasion in 2022. China is much more difficult to really figure out. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to, say, look, the rules-based international order may not have been designed with sort of China and that power in mind, but what can we do to change it so it works for all of us and continues to go? And I think that's one of the areas we need to focus on.
That is a really important point. I mean, you're both highlighting that PLA is engaged in sort of the biggest peacetime buildup, all of its capabilities, nuclear, conventional, certainly Navy. They now have, as you said, the largest Navy, and that we're unclear what's the purpose, right? So you mentioned that the purpose of our Navy, and certainly the US, is to maintain free and open sea lanes, essentially, which underpins our prosperity, the shipping, the commerce, all of that. What's your sense? I mean, obviously you said we don't know yet, but if you were to venture a theory, what are you seeing as China's intent? And what level of dialogue exists now between you and your Chinese counterparts?
So it's really hard to read. There are some really negative indicators. Like the use of coercion around Second Thomas Shoal is unacceptable, right? The fact that's outside the Philippines, and so that's an area claimed by the Philippines where the Chinese Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia have been acting to prevent Philippines resupplying their outpost on Second Thomas Shoal. The China has refused to acknowledge the International Court of Justice ruling on Scarborough Shoal. They are aggressively sailing into Taiwanese waters. You can put that in a separate count because, potentially, I mean, it's just that challenging and nuanced area, but they're doing the same with Japan. They're doing the same with other nations in and around China. Those are really troubling indicators. At the same time, they've got an anti-piracy mission that they've maintained off the Horn of Africa for a long time now, because China's got more dependent on shipping than anyone else, so there's a logic to that. That's the type of positive thing. So what I'd like to see is more of the positive, less of the coercion. That would be really good. I did have the opportunity to meet with my counterpart, Admiral Hu, in Qingdao back in April of last year as part of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. And, it is interesting. I listened to a speech delivered by one of their ministers that could have been given by one of our ministers. So it was all about the same sort of principles of commerce for all, everybody benefits, from all of this. The difference is in the interpretation. And this gets back to what we really need to do is create these opportunities for dialogue where we can really get to understand each other. And when we say this, they often take it a different way. So I'll be quite clear. They assume in Canada that we do whatever the US tells us. They assume that if our press publish something, that we have directed them to publish that. And that is a challenge that, again, the only way they can really get that is to get to know us and to realize, I have no control over what the media says about
Some days
things.
You may wish to have that.
No, generally, I actually enjoy the open media. I'm more actually mystified by, how did they get to that perspective?
Right. No, I appreciate that. Obviously, there's benefit to that kind of dialogue. But then maybe we can go straight to that point that, Canada is controlled by the US, or certainly if we don't believe that, but we can easily say that obviously we have worked very closely with the US and that we enjoy quite an integrated security, economic, and defense relationship. The mission of Canada participating in upholding rules-based order around the world, including in the seas, is very much kind of underpinned by the assumption that the US will be leading that effort. In the last few days, we're seeing President Trump sort of changing a lot of those fundamentals and kind of removing the US from that role potentially of leading and defending the international rules-based order. I know it's early days, and I know I'm kind of inviting you to speculate a little bit, but if you were to sort of engage on that, what does that mean for you and how you're seeing Canada's role and Canada's maritime future in that kind of changing? The Pax Americana, for lack of a better term, era is over. Something else is emerging. We don't know what that is. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, we're at a very interesting moment in history, and I think we have to understand that in the international environment, states act in their own self-interest. You go back even to the Marshall Plan, which was a massive investment by the US to rebuild the world's economies after the Second World War, because they needed markets, they needed exports, they needed a state, they didn't want to have another world war, and that made sense. So even though it cost them a tremendous amount of money, it benefited them in the long run, right? And so I would argue that the US is the sort of the Pax Americana was a benefit for them for a long time.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
And it's, strictly speaking, from a sheer sort of utilitarian point of view, if you accept the argument that Canada was free riding for a period of time where I would argue we fought quite extensively in Afghanistan and did a whole host of other security functions, in the post-Cold War era, that was probably a reasonable bet for Canada to make, given the types of threats that we are, protected by 3 oceans. We're a long way from the rest of the world. And for a long part of our history, that protected us. And so did you need to make a massive investment in defense? And if you do, to what end? Where did we want to engage in the world? And I would argue that the biggest challenge we face in Canada is we've always struggled to figure out what exactly are our foreign policy. Well, what's our neighborhood? What are our foreign policy objectives other than values, democracy? And okay, that's great. What does that mean? Trade. Okay, well, to what extent? How? How are we going to foster that? With whom? Because, number one trading partner is directly south of us. So I think what we really need to do right now is say, what do we want to be in the world? What's our role in the world? What do we want to contribute? When I do presentations, I sometimes show a slide from January of 1958. And it's of HMCS Magnificent, back when we had an aircraft carrier, sailing across the Atlantic. On board is all of the Canadian Army's equipment, lots of Army equipment. Because just the year previous, we had the Suez Crisis, and Canada had the diplomatic weight to negotiate a settlement between warring partners, the UK, France, of the interest to the US and to the USSR at the time, and Israel. And we said we will put a peacekeeping force in the Middle East to help to stabilize that situation and allow people to back away. Canada had the diplomatic weight to be able to pull that off, to be listened to have the idea. And then we had the military might to back that up, right? And we have this myth of ourselves as blue-helmeted peacekeepers. We have not been that nation.
But 30 years.
I would
Maybe
argue longer.
Yeah, maybe longer.
So if we want to be that, then we have to have a military that does that. And the number one thing I would say is that it does certainly seem as though there's a consensus in Canada that we need to be investing properly in defense. I hope we don't just look at the number, but we figure out what is it we want to have in terms of military and security capabilities. And I would argue security capabilities. Infrastructure in the north fits defense and security purposes.
And dual use economic as well.
Yes, exactly. So we should be very smart about the investments we make. And, is 2% the right number? It's an arbitrary number. What's the right investment for Canada? It might be more than 2%. And it shouldn't just be we've hit a number. It's got to be we've made the right investments.
I think what I'm hearing you say, Admiral, is that we need a fundamental rethink of our foreign policy, of our national security strategy, documents that don't exist, at least not publicly. It's wonderful that we have an Indo-Pacific strategy, but that's a regional strategy in the absence of an overall global strategy that sort of says the world has changed. What do we want? How do we advance our interests? How do we protect our values? And what kind of capabilities we need for that, both from defense, diplomacy, as well as kind of the dual use stuff that you're mentioning for the Arctic, right?
That's right. And the depressing thing for me as someone who has studied international politics for a long time is that the last prime minister to really try and take that on was Paul Martin. In the early 2000s.
Yes,
exactly. And he did. He wanted to do a development review, a diplomacy review, and a defense and security policy.
But I think he didn't last very much.
So the lesson every politician took away from that is that did not help him win the next election. In fact, that brought in the Conservative government, right? So there are no votes in this stuff in Canada in the current environment. So it is really challenging for us to, how do we really make sure that we have this sophisticated discussion about what Canada should be in the world and how we best fit our role, without forgetting we need to take care of our people here. Because if we don't have a strong country, strong economy, and all the social support structures we need, then we're not going to be able to sustain the support we need to continue the security investments that we need.
If one were to be optimistic or try to find the silver lining in the current crisis, would you say that the current moment sort of is putting that question much more sort of front and center, that we need to figure this out, not just because of the trade tariffs, but also because the world is changing and our assumptions about the US might be changing too?
Yeah, I would agree that's exactly it. Canada is having to have a very serious discussion about what do we want to do in terms of security policy. The positive I would offer is that if you go back and look in our history at some moments where we made the greatest increases in sort of social supports and things like that, the introduction of public health care across Canada, were also periods where we had a significant defense and security, significant economic growth. We can do all of this at once if we commit ourselves to do it and do it in the right way and make the right investments, which does unfortunately mean that we got to figure out a fair and equitable tax structure and a whole bunch of other stuff that's way beyond my stuff. That's where I count on others to figure out, if you're going to keep a defense budget that's 2% of GDP, then you have to have a sustainable, structure that allows government to be properly resourced.
Yeah. I mean, I know I have many other questions. And before I go to the audience, let me ask about kind of your priorities, because I know last year you did something fairly unusual from what I understand and kind of put out a video that got a lot of attention talking about the state of readiness of the Canadian Navy, but also more generally armed forces. And in that video, you sort of said you have 3 priorities, which I found really impressive in that it's succinct. It's kind of people, platforms, and readiness to fight. We've spoken about platforms quite a bit and the investments that are needed. You know, we've spoken obviously about the readiness to fight, but maybe people, which is sort of the backbone of any organization. I would imagine the same would be true for the Navy. We've all heard about the challenges that you have in both recruitment and retention and sort of processing people who are applying. Could you speak to where that is now and the successes that you've had with a program that a number of us have heard about, which is the Navy Experience Program, which is sort of an internship. I'd never heard of it. I think it's a wonderful idea. So maybe if you could share both what is working as a result of kind of the efforts you've made, but also the challenge still.
I mean, people remains my number one priority and my number one challenge. So we are 23% short of the sailors. So effectively, we were missing 1 out of every 4 sailors that we should have. The Canadian Armed Forces as a whole, about 16% short. So the Navy, it's a bit more extreme because we're a smaller service, so each one hurts us more. Now, the positive signs, we've been doing an awful lot of work to stabilize that. So indications are at the moment that we've hit bottom. We're not getting smaller. Our retention is actually good, but retention is just, it can change on a dime. When people get fed up or they don't believe there's hope anymore, they can leave. So we're very focused on continuing to be an employer of choice for everybody. I really do feel as though the Navy lives up to the value proposition of, join the Navy, you're going to see the world. You're going to live an adventure with purpose. Right, we're going to we do something that matters each and every day that helps people, whether it's here at home or around the world. The Naval Experience Program has been fantastic. The target we set when we began was that we wanted 80% of the people who got through the program to stay in the Navy, ideally. We're actually hitting that number. It's still early days. Now, that's the people who get through the program. Now, one of the things is attrition in that program is not necessarily a bad thing because it was deliberately designed around a probationary period. So if the people didn't reflect the values and ethics that we are looking for in a sailor, then they don't make it through the program. If we're not the right fit for them because they get seasick, because they realize that, this life at sea, it's not for everyone. It really is a difficult life. And some people just can't make it work. And so some of those people have gone on to serve in the Army and the Air Force, which is fantastic. But we're keeping about 60% are staying in hard sea trades in the Navy. Another 20% are staying in occupations that support the Navy wearing a naval uniform. Of the people who get through the program. So really pleased with where that's at. $42,000 for a year of education and training and experience in the Navy, the chance to see the world, a chance to see both coasts of Canada, because we'll send you to both Victoria and to Halifax over the course of that, and you still get 4 weeks of leave and free room and board.
That's amazing. And you're targeting people who are just graduating, or what's sort of the...
So we used to say that our target demographic was 18 to 25. 18 to 25. But then I learned that so we're not in the 1970s anymore. The average age of Canada used to be 24. It's now 42. 48 in Newfoundland, which has historically been one of our top sources of recruits. And so when you're thinking about half the population being older than 48, I think it's actually the median age, that's a problem.
And so trying to bring in 18-year-olds.
So we have to change the way we do business. And so most people, because of the impact of Hollywood, when they think about joining the military, they think about full metal jacket, being screamed at in basic training. And we're not like that anymore. But
I like that.
But it is still fundamentally built around the idea of taking an 18-year-old male away from their family and teaching them everything. And that is not the reality when we're going to be trying to attract people in their late 20s and 30s. And so we're changing. The Naval Reserve is evolving. You may have heard the Premier of Yukon and the Minister announced the intention to explore creating a Naval Reserve Division in Whitehorse, because we want to be up where people are in different parts of the world, because the people who survive in the Yukon and are in the Canadian North are our type of people. There are people who can deal with harsh climates, long separations from home, difficult environments. We're like, yeah, that is our people.
But there's only 200,000 people up there, right? Yeah. So it's a small pool.
So that's why we're exploring Whitehorse. We only have 2 Naval Reserve Divisions here in British Columbia. Discovery, not far from here. We're looking to create already a satellite in Surrey, maybe a full-blown unit there. the Malahat across in Victoria, where our base is, that makes sense. But do we need something in Kelowna or in the interior, up around Prince Rupert? And the vision for the Naval Reserve is, rather than being just sort of a place where people wonder, what is that thing that follows the naval ensign? We want it to be the face of the Navy that recruits and attracts Canadians in, and the entry point for the Navy. So rather than the idea that you sign up for the military and we ship you off to Saint Jean, Quebec, or to Borden, Ontario, and you're just gone from your family right away, we want you to go down to a Naval Reserve Division that's close to home, because they'll be in all the major cities in Canada. And you start off and it's a full-time job. The only difference is you're going to work 8 to 4 as opposed to 9 to 5. And then we're going to go through all of the basic introductory stuff. Here's your uniform. Here's our values and ethics codes. Here's the basic stuff you need to learn. And once the person's completed that sort of initial this is just the information you need to know, then we can take them away for the residential phase, which for the Navy is going to be around a naval environment. So right now we send everybody into the Army. Everybody has to build and defend a forward operating base. To pass basic training, part of it is a 16-kilometer rucksack march. No one in the Navy needs to be able to do a 16-kilometer rucksack march. So it's not a pass-fail criteria for me. It is a pass-fail criteria for you to be able to do a small party task in a boat. So for you to be able to defend a ship. And so all of the performance objectives and basic training can be done in a naval environment. And so that's what we're doing. We're looking to do that through the Naval Reserve and create an opportunity for people to come at a different point in life. But the other thing is that we know that not everybody's going to make it through that. So we're working with a number of different places like BC IT to say, what are the standards for that, for a watchkeeper, deckhand, these things. What if our basic training incorporated everything you needed to do to be qualified as a deckhand? So that even if you didn't pass the Navy part, but you got the qualification, you could go work for BC Ferries. Because even the people who work on the white spot in the BC Ferries need to have Transport Canada certifications to fill out the crew. Well, if we start to provide those, then we're building the sailor capacity of Canada. And so we want to work with the marine industry to figure out ways that make sure that everybody can find their place in the marine industry in Canada.
That makes sense. And that's part of the shipbuilding strategy you mentioned. One of the
That's
scale,
right.
We need people. We need
we
qualified
want a
people.
national sailor building program as well, right? So how do we build the human capacity to do this as well? That helps places like C-SPAN, that helps BC Ferries, that helps the tug and barge operators around here, because there's a tremendous demand and the fishing fleets. There's a tremendous demand for people who work on the water. But we're not meeting that demand right now. And we've got to reprioritize towards, with apologies to those from universities in the crowd, really reprioritize towards trades to an extent as well, because AI will not take a plumber's job.
That's a really good point. I know there's probably, it's snowing as well. What a beautiful view. Again, thank you so much for everybody who's here with us in person, and you get a chance to ask questions. There are many topics I haven't covered. We haven't spoken enough about, obviously, what's happening in China, South China Sea. But if there are questions, please raise your hand. Just tell us who you are. Yes, please. And there's a mic coming your way. No, in the front here.
Yes, my name is Paul Meyer. I'm with Simon Fraser University, former Canadian diplomat. Two short questions, if I may. A new threat has recently emerged in terms of damage to undersea cables, and I'm curious as to how the Royal Canadian Navy feels it can detect and deter that type of sabotage. And secondly, just on the personnel front, government made an important decision, I think last year, to extend eligibility to permanent residents as well as citizens. And I'm told that prompted a huge wave of applicants, but the actual acceptance rate is a small fraction. And it seems to me that this needs to be dealt with if you're going to, in fact, reach those staffing quotas that you're aiming at. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. Those are great questions, and I had them on my list, so I'm glad somebody asked them. Please.
All right, so starting with subsurface cables, obviously a concern. The one advantage that we have is that it tends to only be a threat in waters that are shallower, so probably not as much of a challenge off the BC coast. Now, some countries like Russia absolutely have the capacity, but otherwise, most of that would be in our waters where we've got some monitoring on the surface. The number one thing I think we need to do is make sure that we work collectively to map them all out, to understand our subsurface architecture. And to give you a case in point, we often don't realize our vulnerabilities. In November of 22, I was the Joint Task Force Pacific Commander in Victoria when we had the floods, that wiped out the Coca Hall and everything else like that. I did not know that at the time there were only 3 major internet cables across Canada. And 2 of them were wiped out in that, and 1 was exposed. It was no longer buried, it was exposed. And fortunately, we kept that because otherwise all sort of internet for Vancouver would have been coming from outside of Canada, would have been coming by other means and complicating things. So we don't understand our own vulnerability in critical infrastructure sometimes. And in a period of time where there are real world threats, Russia would like nothing better than to harm us at some times. You know, there are other actors, Iran, North Korea, who would love to disrupt things around here, especially when we continue to enforce sanctions against North Korea. We have vulnerabilities that we're not aware of that can come through cyberspace and other areas. So we really do need to do a better critical infrastructure understanding here. And that means we have to work with provinces and cities, because we all have these vulnerabilities that we're not aware of until something goes down, and all of a sudden it's like, how is it possible? Like Halifax just lost its drinking water for a couple of days. And why is that? What other vulnerabilities like that do we not know about that could have an impact on Canada? And so subsurface cables overall is we need a response capability. What's the best response capability there is understanding everything that's happening. So maritime domain awareness, and then the ability to do something about it. And that comes back to, the single biggest deterrence, the submarine. Why? Because we can track what people are doing. One of the challenges is understanding what's happened. In the turbot war back in the 1990s, the key piece of information was images from HMCS Ojibwa, one of our submarines at the time, that allowed the government to know that a Spanish trawler was fishing illegally. We got the video evidence to prove that. That allowed the government to have the confidence to seize that vessel, confirm it physically, and go to the United Nations and say, here's proof that this was happening illegally. And that was a key moment in unlocking all of that. So that's using military capabilities to support other things, right? So we're supporting other government departments. Permanent residence. Bureaucracies are a beautiful thing. The mystery for me ever since I became a base commander, I took over HMCS the CFB Halifax in 2012, and I thought, this is fantastic. I am going to go down and sort out all the people in the admin office and base supply who have never, got my pay right and have never given me the stuff I want. And then I met the people there and realized that they were trying their best every day to deliver services. And so we really have to ask ourselves sometimes, what is it about bureaucracy that takes, well-intentioned, good faith people and creates this thing where we just can't get anything done? And
have you come with an answer to that? I think a lot of people would be interested in the answer to that question.
So focus on delivery is a big thing, right? So what are service standards, and how do we meaningfully enforce service standards? And then the other one is, how do we make sure, and so what my mantra as a base commander was, we need to see the person, not the problem, and we need to be focused on the outcome, not the process. Yeah. Right? And so, that's the key in all of this. And so a classic example is the Naval Experience Program. One of the things was, it was all designed that after 366 days, you were out of the military. Unless we said, hey, you look good, we want to keep you. And the individual said, I want to stay. It took 2 yeses to stay in. Well, we had a couple of misconduct instances around month 9. And the initial reaction of the system was to say, okay, well, they need to be placed on counseling and probation for 6 months. So you're going to need to give them a new contract to take them through to the end of this. And I'm like, no, the whole point was they've messed up. They're not fit for us. This is where they go. We don't need a new process, and we're definitely not hiring them to be able to fire them properly. Right? This makes no sense. And it took a little while, and and it was, as soon as you put it in the right terms, it was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes no sense. You're right, we won't do that. But our default is to do things. So with permanent residence, what happened is we weren't in position to really understand how do we work with Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada to make sure that the data that they use to grant permanent residency, we can access that data, that we can get past all sorts of stuff. And then there was a privacy concern, and I'm like, well, the privacy concern is really easy. If the person doesn't sign something to say that we've got access to those records, then the discussion about them joining the Canadian Armed Forces is over, right? If you're not prepared to give us access to that, you're not going to get a security clearance, so you can't serve. So we're in a much better place. So initially it was a very small number. I think we've now increased 5-fold over the last little while. It is still a challenge, because security really matters, and we cannot grant high-level security clearances to someone who's not a Canadian citizen. And so there has to be a path to citizenship in all of this. And there has to be a way for us to really make sure that we understand the background of that individual. But to be honest, most permanent residents, we have that information, so we should be able to bring.
That's great. Thank you. Other questions? So I see 3 hands. Maybe we'll take a few at a time. So in the back, and then Fareed, then Eve, and then Calvin, and then Jihave. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Colin Laughlin. I write for a Canadian magazine called Maritime Magazine. I was a sea cadet, and I'm wondering if that would allow me 2 questions. Thank you.
If they're quick ones.
Okay, quick one. On the geopolitical issue, you mentioned that Canada has often had maritime boundary disputes with the U.S., and there's a mechanism to resolve those. Let's talk about the 9 dash? I've lost the number of dashes that are on
11
them.
dash,
Yeah.
10 dash.
Is there a mechanism that can actually be decided judicially, or is China just going to have its way and say, this is our version, it's the correct one? That's the first question. The other one is with respect to your good point that Canada's defense spending has risen and fallen based on our economy. And there's a new ethos that's developing in the country right now, given all of the political dynamics going on. Is it the time to turn that around and say, no, it should be reversed? That if we had a defense-led economy, manufacturing, shipbuilding, that sort of thing, on a much grander scale, that our economy could benefit and follow that rather than the other way around.
Great. Two wonderful questions for Reid, and then we'll go to Eve and then Calvin for this round. Yeah. Mike is coming.
Thank you. Admiral, I find that the armed forces are not visible, and the communities or the country does not have the relationship that they did in the past. And this is something that there's a number of honorary colonels here and lieutenant colonels. We find that our hands at many times are tied in terms of promoting the CAF. And we want to know how you deal with that. It is something that we find with many immigrants here, 20-25% of our population, they don't know the history of the Canadian Armed Forces to this country, and they don't realize the area of service. So all of this comes back to maybe the bureaucracy that you mentioned or other. This is something that I feel is really missing and no one is talking about.
These are all great questions. We'll try to remember them. Eve? Yeah.
Thank you, Admiral. I'm Yves Tibrian from UBC, and in 2022 I had the honor of serving on the Indo-Pacific Advisory Committee to the Foreign Minister. In light of the current Greenland argument from the US that it's a national security issue because there are Chinese and Russian ships, if we look at, say, 2040, what more should Canada do to be ready so that the Arctic is seen as secure or perceived? It's also about US perception, but demonstrated to the US as being completely secured by the Canadian side.
Great. Thank you so much. And final question, Calvin.
Yes, thanks very
it's
much
coming to you. The mic is coming.
No one
to you.
online could.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for coming. And as Fareed, my colleague, said, it's great to see more public exposure. My question is, with the tariffs, with the challenges, from my understanding, in terms of the participation in AUKUS, in terms of the collaboration with our Five Eyes partners, and then sadly with my insight, in terms of the foreign investment, in terms of the ports, the partnerships in terms of corporately with shipbuilding companies, and the foreign ownership of even some of our ports, do you not think that perhaps puts us in terms of a difficult relationship currently, and possibly even contributing to some of the current responses that we're seeing from our allies?
Great, thank you so much. So a test for us to see if we remember them. But South China Sea in China, and whether there's a legal recourse, as well as obviously a number of things on the...
There was also a defense industry question in there, so I can combine those last two probably really quickly and then come back to some other stuff. So I think we should be smarter about how we do defense investment overall. Where there's a capability gap, we should buy off-the-shelf equipment that's already in service with other countries, get it quickly into service. Where Canada has a comparative advantage, we should look to take the time and develop a capability enhancement. A classic example would be we bought the American maritime patrol aircraft, the P-3, back a long time ago. We then Canadianized it over the course of its life to the point where the Aurora, our version of it, was always better than their version of it and is arguably as good as the P-8 that we're now buying to replace it because the wings are falling off of ours. And so the right sort of investment framework would make a lot of sense in our industry. There was a time when the government of Canada would invest 5% in every ship and aircraft built in Canada Canada because in time of war we would take them and use them ourselves. So would it make sense for us to invest 5%, say, in a mining development in the high north on condition that we had access to the accommodations, we could use their jetties, we could build a fuel farm there? That might, with enhanced development, would give us infrastructure that would benefit that and defray some of the costs. So I think there's a better way to do all of that. But it does bring into the question of security. So when we're looking for investment money, does it matter who owns the company? Yes and no, right? So the problem we run into is the biggest insider threats, when we actually find the spies who've done the most damage, tend to be citizens born in the country. And we assume that someone foreign or foreign linked is negative. So what we actually need is a more sophisticated security culture where we're always asking ourselves, does that person need to know that? Why would they want to know it? And what is that company doing with that? And intellectual property is jealously protected by companies. Can we create things like that where we create frameworks to do that? So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space. With respect to the 9- line and other disputes, the 9- line it actually comes from Taiwan. Interesting. Chiang Kai-shek started that. And there's no logic to it. I think it wouldn't survive any challenge in International Court of Justice, which is why I think China would never let themselves get to that place. But there are some places where lawyers can argue and say, well, what you've built at Fiery Cross Reef, which is now a full-blown military base and hotels and stuff like that, and lands tourists and so on and so forth. Okay, that's clearly no longer the low water elevation or rock that does not have a territorial sea. Lawyers will say it still doesn't get a territorial sea. Instagram and everything else tells us it's an island. And so we're going to have to figure out how we deal with that. And more importantly, how you don't...
These are the artificially created islands.
Yeah, sorry, I should have the background on that. So China did a very smart island building campaign that we should have figured out and stopped a lot sooner. We didn't. And so, we're not going to be able to change the facts on the ground. We can, like I said, we can keep holding to the legal argument, which would make sense, but ultimately it's worth trading that for something else that makes sense in terms of getting them to buy into the system. Canadians aren't aware of the military. It's a perennial challenge, but it's not unique to us. Most people around the world don't have that same notion of service. I actually had to explain to my flag lieutenant the other day what a Rotary was, like a Rotarian club, because he'd never heard of them, a service club and other things, because they're not common in the same way. And so I think the way past that is our cadets are an outstanding organization. So thank you for having me in a Sea Cadet. Teaches citizenship, leadership, and physical fitness. Citizenship. These are great things, and as a parent of 4 kids, it's paid for. The diversity in the cadets is fantastic. We would love to convert more cadets into the military. But more importantly, how do we get more people to get a notion of serving Canada? And so I do think that there should be a conversation potentially around some form of national service in Canada. Not conscription, not into the military alone. That could be one of the options. But the government has talked about planting 2 billion trees. Could Canadians from 18 to 25 spend 6 to 12 months planting trees, doing flood and fire mitigation, wildfire fighting, long-term care facility things? What are nation-building projects that we could take on that at the end of it, you get $20,000 towards education because you've done your 6, 12 months of service. You do it somewhere where you're not from. You meet Canadians who are not like you, and it's not through a device.
Is there any uptake for that idea? Because what you're mentioning is also building national resilience, something that everybody talks about, and in today's kind of whole of society defense that's needed. Yeah. That seems like a really logical kind of...
So I think it is. I mean, it's like, can we come to an agreement about what it would be? And you wouldn't have to put every Canadian through it. Just the mere fact of having every Canadian sign up for it, I think, in that period, and then select 10, 20%, whatever makes sense. Because again, coming back to bureaucracies, I can't even imagine the bureaucracy we would create around that program. But I think there's a real opportunity, because one of the concerns I have is how do you overcome polarization in this day and age? And then that leads to building for the future. What are we going to do? Where should Canada be in the Arctic in 2040? I come back to, we should be invested in the Arctic and dual use infrastructure. We should be making sure we've got the right investments. Submarines are the number one capability that the U.S. would be looking for us to make sure that we can control our waters. And, a diesel electric submarine is the ideal platform to make sure nothing goes through the Bering Strait that would hurt Canadian purposes. Nothing gets through the Davis Strait that would be bad for us. We forget our own history, and it wasn't as much of a factor on this coast, I suppose. In the Battle of the St. Lawrence in 1943 and 44, 23 ships were sunk in Canadian waters, i.e. within 12 miles of Canada's shores, including all the way up the St. Lawrence River, almost to Quebec City. They sank the ferry between Sydney and Port aux Basques, the Caribou. The last Canadian ship sunk in the Second World War was HMCS Esquimalt, named for our base, 16th of April, 1945, within sight of Chebucto Head, their home port. Right? So that war came to Canada. And so if we don't have the ability to defend our waters, which means understanding everything that's on and under the water and in the airs and above it, right up to space, the ability to talk about it, so a communications architecture, and then the ability to respond and to react to that across the spectrum of required capabilities. And so that's what we need to be building. That's what the U.S. expects of us. And to be honest,
that's what we need. Yes. Yes. And I think the final question was more about, is there any sort of, any evidence to some of the, I guess, things that we're hearing from the Trump administration, particularly about our ports, about fentanyl, about the fact that they're subsidizing our continental defense. So, and I mean, this was in a press release that came out 2 days ago from the White House explaining the tariffs, and everybody kind of focused obviously on the economic arguments, but there's a whole section that deals with U.S. subsidizing Canada's defense, right? And some facts that even to me as a layperson, I can see that are not accurate. So maybe you could speak to that in terms of exactly how much U.S. is spending, how much we're spending for NORAD and our own defense.
So the partnership in NORAD is a fantastic thing. Having served down in Colorado Springs, it's unbelievable. It's a fascinating history to it too. It began in 1957. Because the two people responsible for air defense of Canada and the US had fought together in the Second World War, and they agreed that the only logical way to defend against Soviet bombers that were beginning to have the ability to come fly over the Canadian North and into the US was to basically erase the border and to treat all airspace as one North American airspace. So they did that. But the reason NORAD was created in 1958 was because it took a year for the politicians to figure out that they'd agreed to do that without the authority to do so. So the NORAD Treaty was then signed. Which recognized that sort of initiative of two generals determined to protect their countries. NORAD's the only binational alliance in the world, meaning a Canadian officer can give an order to an American platform to shoot something else down. We don't.
Saw with the Chinese balloons, right?
That's right. And so, and this is it. So every deputy commander, if the commander is American, the deputy commander is Canadian across Canada. So we have an American one-star who's the deputy commander of the Canadian NORAD region in Winnipeg. The deputy commander at NORAD is Blaise Frawley, a Canadian three-star. On 9/11, it was a Canadian officer who gave the order to ground all air traffic across the United States, which caught Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, by surprise at the time because he did not know a Canadian had that power. We do to this day. Right? So when something bad happens in the U.S. in the air or a threat happens on the sea, there is a Canadian involved in working with them to stop that threat. And the other thing I can't help but notice selfishly from the Navy perspective is that right now, Harry DeWolf, the first of the Arctic and offshore patrol vessels, is on its way into the Caribbean because for the last 19 years, we've been deploying ships regularly to interdict the flow of drugs across the American southern border. So I would argue that the Canadian Navy has been doing an awful lot, probably as much arguably as the U.S. Navy, to interdict illegal crossings across the southern border of the U.S. to stop illegal flows in that part of the world. Because we work with them, and we always have.
I mean, it seems like right now we need to really get this information out there and actually have, at least for those who are interested in facts, I know that's not everyone, but that we should actually be able to make those available. I know there are other questions in the room, but I really do want to be respectful of Admiral's time and everybody else's time. Maybe as a final thought, Admiral, if you could share with us sort of what keeps you hopeful in the current moment, because we are living through such turbulent times. And of course, people who are in uniform and who do what you do day to day, you have a way to manage that kind of stress and that kind of uncertainty. So if you could both tell us what keeps you hopeful and then a word of advice to how to navigate the current turbulence.
What keeps me hopeful is the sailors I work with. We have incredible sailors in the Royal Canadian Navy, and my job really is to enable them and empower them to keep doing the incredible stuff that they do and find some more sailors to join them and help ease the burden. But that is also what gives me hope. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I tend to believe in the inherent goodness of humanity. When we can actually see the problems and the people who are at the heart of them, we tend to react. It's when it's not humanized, when it's polarized across social media, but when people actually confront it, and we see this all the time in the Navy, when we go around the world and we talk to a Somali fisherman off the coast of Somalia and realize that their life was a choice between shark fishing, where you bring a shark into the boat and then literally try and beat it to death with a stick before it bites you. In a world where that's your sort of subsistence existence, piracy kind of makes sense. And so when we start to understand what are the human factors, human causes, and all of this, and if we can get a better understanding of that, I really do believe that there is more that unites us than divides us, but that social media today is accentuating differences. And so we do the glass half empty version of that is there's no indication that we're going to get a grip on social media and all of that other stuff. But I am generally optimistic.
That's wonderful. And of course, these kinds of events are hopefully part of the sort of the conversation, getting people to see perspectives that are different from theirs. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and for sharing all your thoughts so openly. I also want to thank everyone who's in the room for supporting another Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada event that features Canadians who are doing important work in the Indo-Pacific and are advancing our interests in deepening Canada's understanding of the region. And I also want to thank all of Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada staff who've made today's event possible. It was a difficult morning to get going, and the snow continues, but I really want to thank all of them for the support for this event and all of the other events. We have another event this afternoon for those who are able to come back on transnational repression and digital threats that are emanating from the Indo-Pacific. Again, thank you everyone who joined us online, and we hope to see you at future Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada events. Thank you so much. Thank you.